Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the BetTALker podcast. Today we have Andy Gallie, who is an. Is it okay to say expert by experience or life experience? How would you?
Yeah, any way you want to, whatever
Okay.
you want to call me, really, Pedro. But yeah, lived experience, expert by experience. Um, yeah, lived experience. I tend to go by.
So I wanted to ask you, because I know a little bit your story. I read about you, but for those that they don't know you, would you be able to tell us a little bit about your story? How did you got introduced to gambling, and
Mm.
how things went downhill, and now in your recovery path, how are you doing?
Yeah, of course. No problem at all. So as I say, lived experience of gambling, the armed forces, and unfortunately, the criminal justice system. So I started at a very, very young age of 9 years old. And having now obviously been through therapy, been through recovery, I can see why gambling took a hold so early. So I was that annoying child who would constantly be back to my
Hmm.
mum saying, "When are we going? I just want to go now. I'm bored. I'm bored. I'm bored." The night that she gave me some money to gamble at a local caravan park, an entertainment kind of place, everybody was happy. So I was occupied. I was away, excited, gambling. My mum was happy because I wasn't causing any arguments for her and her partner. And my
Hmm.
sisters were happy because their mum was happy. So actually, it's really, really interesting to look back at why I took it so early. I'm not saying consciously I knew at 9 years old that's what was happening, but looking back, I can see. So at 10, 11, 12, continued gambling almost every single day in the local arcade. I lived in a seaside town in Cornwall. And at age 30, my mum had actually called in Gamblers Anonymous to try and stage an intervention. And I come home from school and there was a lady just sat on the sofa and said, "Look, we need to talk. You've got a problem." Obviously, that direct approach wasn't going to work with a young child. Um, so it's carried on, it's escalated up until 16, 17. Started committing fraud on a bar where I was working at a local hotel, bringing drinks through at zero and pocketing the money. 18, that's where I joined the armed forces. I joined the Royal Navy, and it escalated even further because within that environment, I had a newfound ego, a salary for the first time. And in the automat, which is like a big cafe area next to the shop, there were about 40 fruit machines. And with at every machine, there were one, two, three people all cheering, happy, laughing, joking. Now, for 9 years, I've been told what I'm doing is wrong, and gambling is very wrong. But I'm now seeing people from all over the country, people from all different backgrounds, religions, a whole raft of people were all doing what I've been told was wrong. So this completely normalized it for me. I knew what I was doing was okay. By the age of 23, I was £30,000 in debt. So that's where signing a 22-year contract with the armed forces, the banks were quite happy to lend you as much as you wanted. It, my wife had no clue. I was trying to hide the mail. I was trying to hide our bank statements, trying to hide any financial problems. She knew I gambled and she knew it was a problem. It caused many an argument. But this is where, whenever she questioned me, this is where domestic abuse become a real issue. And again, didn't see it at the time, but I talk about it now. And that's where, the lies, the mood swings, the hiding things, the financial abuse, coercive control even, and gaslighting to get her away from the subject of gambling. So this has carried on. I left the Navy in 2011 after visiting 63 countries and gambling in 60 of them, even playing poker in a metal hut in Sierra Leone. It shows that it's not about money. That's about the buzz and the escape and the dopamine hit that even being in there, taking the risk, was having. So I've left in 2011. I started working at Red Roof Rugby Club, a National League rugby club. I gambled every day from 8 till 4, and then started work at about 4:30, 5 o'clock when the volunteers come in. Wife thought I was doing 14 or 15-hour days. Drinking has always been an issue. Anger when I drink and when I lose. And I've then gone, my first marriage come to an end after 15 years, met my second wife on the very same day that I left a 15-year marriage. So when we talk about impulse control, and, you know, it was ridiculous. And I've moved away to London, started work at the Not Forgotten Association, worked at Buckingham Palace and James's Palace. And that's where I was first convicted of fraud for £47,500. I professed that I was going to get all this help, and I'm going to fix myself, and I'm going to be okay. Within weeks, months, I was back gambling as heavy as ever. And my second marriage come to an end, moved back to Cornwall. After a night out of heavy drinking, after a big loss, I committed an ABH, one of the most abhorrent things I'll ever admit to. Never believed I'd raise my hands to anybody. But that's where life had spiraled to. And I ended up in prison. I've asked for help in prison, only to be told it's a secondary addiction and we need to deal with your alcohol. And even those people, the professionals, did not get it. And I thought I was broken for life. I could not break the gambling. So I've got out, I completed level 2, level 3 counselling skills, started a level 4 diploma in addiction counselling, and I needed volunteer hours. So a local rehab centre offered me a job, and then withdrew it when the HR department knew about the ABH. Therapists were happy, they talked to me about it. And my life crashed again, and I took a job somewhere I didn't really want to be, in a job I didn't want to do, but I just wanted to be normal. And what actually happened was I started playing the free spins, I started taking the free bets, and then it was a scratch card, and then the bookies, and then back online gambling. And within 5 months, I had taken £198,000 from my employer, plus salary, plus sold my car, plus that everything was gone yet again. And I was obviously facing prison. I'd already had 2 suicide attempts in life, and I'd planned a third one. And all I needed, selfishly, was my family to tell me to get out of their lives, and which they had promised to do if I ever done it again. And they didn't. They said, we've read up on the addiction. We really, really just want you to get help because you're brilliant when you're good. And that's when I drove home. I phoned Gordon Moody, and I now know to be Dave Hollingsworth. Gave me a call back on New Year's Eve of all times. And by February, I was into rehab, completed the 14 weeks, and met the most amazing lived experience therapist, I think, or person in my life that I'll ever meet. And I got it. After 4 or 5 weeks of lying, manipulating, or thought I was manipulating, I was there to reduce my prison sentence. I was there to save my relationship. I was there for all the wrong reasons, until that man called me out one day, and I just knew he got me. I knew I couldn't lie to him. I knew he knew everything I was, doing. And I loved recovery. I literally, it became my new compulsion, really. It made just a little bit healthier one. So I went back to prison, and I set up peer support groups within the prison, carried out one-to-ones on a pastoral level with prisoners, collated a lot of information around the gambling aspects within prison. And on release, I went back to work for the Alerts, which was a lived experience group. And I was fortunate enough to be offered a role by Beacon Counselling Trust on the Armed Forces Gambling Support Network, which I now do to this day. And that also includes going back into prisons for veterans in custody, training up peer mentors within prison, as well as delivering to service personnel, veterans. And I love it. It's absolutely a new passion. So that was quite a long version, Pedro. I apologise, but
no, I mean it's fascinating. Thank you, for sharing. I was thinking, when you were telling me that you were a child, and that your mom will give you money, to go to the arcades, I was thinking, did you ever got attentional deficit disorder, or anything like that, or?
I'm 100% positive, Pedro, that I haven't got the label, during my prison time, it was suggested to me that actually the way my brain works, I've always thought it was completely normal to have about 100 thoughts going through your head at one time, to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's like a light switch, your brain goes on, and I can't settle. I'm thinking about something 10 years ago, I'm thinking about something in 5 years' time. I overthink absolutely every aspect of life, and I'm very, very compulsive. So it was suggested to me that I need to go for a diagnosis. The reason I don't is probably due to the bit of stigma that's in society at the minute, that people are saying that everybody's got it and everybody's getting diagnosed. And it's actually put me off following through on that. So yeah, it's interesting, but I believe there's a real strong link there.
I mean, there may be like a bit of a continuum, because when you talk about the impulsivity and all of that was early in life, also something that was quite interesting, that your mom got you like an intervention at 13, did you say?
13.
I mean, it sounds a bit like it's good, but I don't feel that maybe like a sort of traditional intervention. I don't know. What do you think could be helpful? Or could have been helpful back then for you? If
Well, I'm
anyone got.
really, yeah, it's a really intriguing question, because I've always just assumed she was trying to do her best, which she probably thought she was. And I was causing a lot of havoc in the home, arguments, stealing money from my mum, from family members, So I get it, but at the same time, that direct approach, that almost being labelled as having a problem at such a young age, what I actually needed at that point was probably a role model, somebody I looked up to, that my mum could have had a conversation with, to say, look, can you have a chat to him just on a level? Again, we talk about lived experience, but myself now going to talk to somebody of that age probably would have a bit more effect, because we warn children a lot about what could happen, whereas actually somebody in front of them that it did happen to is a lot more realistic for them. And that's why I think school age education is essential.
Yeah. What about your dad? Was he around or?
My dad left at 5 years old, and to be honest, it's really intriguing. My sister never believes that I can remember this, but at 2 years old, I remember a massive domestic situation. The police were called. My mum has gone off down the road saying that she's going to commit suicide, took a load of tablets with her. And I can remember that vividly at 2 years old. So at 3, 4, they've obviously tried to work it out, but I remember those constant arguments, my dad being kicked out, then coming back. So my dad left at 5 years old, finally.
Did you had any contact with him or anything when you were?
Yeah, every week. So every Sunday, it was like that Sunday dad thing. It was a thing in the UK, isn't it? That dads pick them up on a Sunday and they have us from 10 till 5, and then you get dropped home again. So yeah.
Did he ever talk to you about gambling, or did he gamble himself? Or?
It's interesting, because my mum always says that he was quite a gambler. I don't remember him gambling a lot at all. She said that he would take her last 50p out of her purse to gamble. So maybe he did. Maybe I was too young to recognise that. I always remember him stereotypically putting on the Grand National bet for us, 50p each way. My sister won. I didn't. And you're seeing all that excitement that she's won £5 or whatever it was. I'd also stand and play the machine, maybe at the rugby club when I was with him, and not a lot was said. I think he brushed it off as being my mum overreacting. So when we talk about that adverse childhood experience, my understanding of a relationship is that they split up, the parents split up, and then they both basically slag each other off for many years. He done this, she done that. He won't buy you this. He won't contribute towards that. All of these things are drilled into you on a daily basis, that your dad's no good. And then when you talk to your dad about it, your mum's nuts. She's off on one. So they're almost playing each other off against each other.
You said that you got into a fight. What happened?
So the ABH.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is where I've always had an issue with jealousy.
Okay.
And I believe it was exacerbated by the gaslighting that I needed to use to get my partner away from the subject. So I would always use infidelity as an accusation. But it also, again, stems back to childhood. So my mum, I would class as being quite promiscuous. And when my mum said, I'm going out for a drink with friends tonight, I would then, I'll see you when I get in. So I would be in bed, I'll be waiting, and I could always hear my mum's high heels coming down the road. It was quite a distinct noise. And I'd hear it and I'd get all excited thinking mum's coming home. She'll be in to say goodnight to me in a minute. And then I would hear a different man's voice. I'd hear a different accent in that man's voice. And I can still remember to this day vividly the anger that I felt, the disappointment that I felt, the upset that I felt, that actually she had chosen these people over me. And that, as a 6-year-old child, 7-year-old child, that's what stuck with me. So when I'm in a relationship and I'm a grown adult, you would expect me to know different. But when my partner says I'm going out for a drink with my friends, my mind goes to, nobody goes out for just a drink with friends. They're going out to look for someone else. And it's a fear that it sticks with you. And that has led to me being absolutely horrendous in a relationship. I can see it now, and I probably see it a little bit at times in my life. But that's only with a lot of reflection and hindsight that I can now openly say. And the reason I talk about it is because there's many relationships out there now being affected by gambling, with the domestic abuse happening within that relationship, that the person doesn't recognize they're doing it. They don't see the mood swings. They don't see the coercive control, the gaslighting, the narcissism, just the lies. And they won't class that as domestic abuse, just a bit of a nightmare in a relationship. But actually, from that partner's point of view, I can't speak for them, but those affected others I have spoken to, that is devastatingly harmful. And so anyway, answering your question, so that I was already jealous. We've gone on a night out to a murder mystery night, and I hadn't had a drink for 9 weeks. I was trying to stop because the relationship issues are already there. So I thought stopping drinking will help that, and it does. I have a lot more control over my emotions and thoughts and feelings when I don't drink. And I think we were in a good place. We were in a very good place. My partner said, well, you could have a drink. We've had a really good time. It's brilliant. I had a drink and drank to excess, as I always do. It's all or nothing in everything in life. And in the taxi on the way back, can't really remember much of the taxi journey, but I believe she was flirting with the taxi driver. Now, in the statements, she was actually in the back with me. So I've got really angry at the taxi driver, wanting to go at him. My partner's got involved, and I've unfortunately assaulted and attacked my partner. And as I say, one of the most abhorrent things, I've done a lot in my life, but that it scares the life out of me, and I'm sure has unfortunately scarred that person for the rest of her life. And I haven't had a drink since that night. It's really unfortunate that it took something so devastating to make me realize how dangerous I was in that situation. But all I can do is not drink moving forward, and I do control that a lot better. I've done a lot of work on that side of things.
Tell me a little bit more about the drinking. When did you start drinking?
So I think even at an early age of 14, 15, buying bottles of cider, 2-litre bottles of cider, as children, I say children do, but it was a dumb thing. And then joining the armed forces, where there was a culture of drinking, culture of risk-taking drinking, pushing boundaries. And if you didn't drink, you were almost an outcast. You were a bit weird. If you didn't drink, you were weird. So knowing me as I do, as I just mentioned, I can do nothing in moderation. I still don't believe I can to this day. It's a struggle. So when I have one, I'm having 20. I'm drinking until I am absolutely out of it. Now, when I'm gambling, I mentioned the losses. So my tolerance level was at the point where I needed a couple of £1,000 to get the same buzz from gambling. I couldn't find a couple of £1,000, but I could always find or borrow £20, which gave me enough to go and buy some cheap alcohol to get absolutely annihilated. So when I lost, I drank to forget everything. When I won, I would drink to celebrate, and I'd buy everybody drinks. So alcohol always become an issue. And I was either the very funny friend and the one that you would want to be around and had laughing and joking. And I could turn on a sixpence, as the saying is, in Cornwall. And somebody would say one thing to me and my eyes apparently go black, and I turn into a different person completely. And I was warned of that for 15, 20 years. And I just didn't believe it or didn't want to believe it. I don't know. But yeah.
What do you think it sort of switch? Because you get
Mm.
out of people, that something happened, like some aggression or something, and just
Yeah. It would only take somebody knocking me, or I might hear them say something about me. And friends, I call them, acquaintances in the Navy, they knew this, and they would actively come across and say, Andy, he just called you something. And
okay.
knowing that I'm going to, and they would say, what's this? It'll go within minutes of telling him that somebody's called him something. So, funny for them at the time, I'm sure. And, you had a reputation of being that drinker and that, and you play up to those people's perceptions of you. I wanted to fit in. I always needed to be involved and to be accepted. And people knew you as that drinker. So I played up to that persona.
And you were in the Navy. Did you were like in combat or any sort of?
Yeah, so we were in the Second Gulf War. We were in the war zone there. And obviously being in the Navy, you are a good distance away from any ground attacks or any contact on the ground. I spent 6 months in Afghanistan. And then the rest of the time really is when you're at sea, you're just on constant alert when you're in and around those war zone areas. So you're in defence watches, high alert. You're dressed, ready to go should any missiles come out. The chemical attack was always the main concern for the Navy. A missile that would release chemicals over the ship. And so, the majority of my time at sea was always around smugglers in the Gulf, drug smuggling, oil smuggling. With boarding parties on board. The Royal Marines would board the dhows that would quite often have dates on them. And, you're in the ops room and you're typing it up and you go, it's dates again. But then you would find a large haul of drugs,
Okay. There's also a reputation about sailors that they drink a lot. Is that true, or is a bit of a archetype somehow?
I think when I served, that was definitely the culture still. Every port you got into, the first thing you do, get dressed and go straight to the local pub, find the big bar and get absolutely hammered to the point that you can hardly walk. And as I mentioned earlier, if you didn't, you were almost like an outcast. You were a bit weird if you wanted to go and see the sights. I've been to countries such as the Seychelles, the islands on the Seychelles, Dubai and South Africa for 7 weeks, and some of the most amazing countries. And I spent the majority of that time in casinos or bars. I didn't see the countries. I didn't look at anything cultural. It was purely just drinking and just taking risks. I think having been back into military bases recently to deliver training, the culture has changed. I think as the generations have changed, the MOD have certainly done a lot of work in that area, and alcohol has become a lot less prevalent.
I mean, I think it's also maybe of the times, because I don't know how old are you, but I mean, like my generation, when you were 14 years old, you go to the convenience store and say, can I have a 6-pack for my dad? Yeah, here you go. Then you have a 6-pack with your friends, and it's a bit like, okay, these days, they lose their license, or even like kids, they are very health conscious, even at the university, there's a lot of kids that they don't drink, I say, okay, it's it's probably something similar in the army, like people maybe they're a bit like, okay, they want the fitness or whatever,
Mm.
or they want to achieve some goals or something like that. Uh, what about Gordon Moody? I was working as
Mm.
in gambling therapy. I
Yeah.
think it was like 2016 or something like that. When did you say 2011?
No, 2021.
2021. Okay, so that
Yeah,
was after my time there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And who was how was the was like a 6 weeks, or was still 14 weeks back then, or
Mm. It was 14 weeks, and I went into the Beckenham
okay,
rehab
back
centre.
yeah.
And what I always refer back to it, and you hear a lot of people in recovery say, "Oh, such and such saved my life," or it saved my life. I can 100% tell you that Gordon Moody stay saved my life. So when I hear that rehab doesn't work or rehab is too expensive, how much do you value my life? Because I guarantee I've spoken to others that will also say that Gordon Moody have saved and changed their life. Um, it for me, it wasn't necessarily the program. I think it was taking me out of society and away from everything for 14 weeks played a big part. I think the cohort that I was a part of, my residents that were there with me, the, all of their experiences, the fact it was a rolling program, so some of them have been in there longer and could help me a bit themselves. But really, for me, was genuinely my therapist having lived experience. And I mentioned Dave Hollingsworth, yet another amazing man who, played a massive, massive part in really making me look at myself, making me understand that I needed to be a little bit more controlled in life and just to consider things before I act. Dave was very, very good at doing that, and listening.
Mhm. Something important, what you say is like, okay, there's this, I know that there's not infinite funds, but
Mm,
sometimes uh, you can't put price, so okay, if a person has a heart attack, you're
mm,
going to say, oh, this operation is going to be 60K, we're sorry,
mm,
things are tough, or we say, okay, maybe a residential program, is 50K, but okay, if you don't do it, then you may end up in jail, or you may end up
mm,
using more money from someone else, or spending your own money.
mhm,
So it's a difficult situation, because you get this sort of obsession of, okay, we need to streamline, we need to, and it's a bit like, look, with addictions, it's not even, the relapse is very common, and you may get people. I think we were in a meeting in reception, and there were a couple of people that said, look, I had to go a couple of times,
mm,
to a residential treatment program, and that's the nature of addiction, that people relapse. I
mm.
don't truly believe that, okay, you can do a ECBT online course, and you're going to fix 30 years of problems in 1 hour awake in front of your computer.
I am in 100% agreement with you. I don't, yeah, like for some people, as you know yourself, the PGSI score, the Problem Gambling Severity Index score, will dictate what kind of treatment you receive. And I think for some people, they maybe do need that, intervention, just an hour a week to openly talk about, their thoughts, feelings, and emotions. And that's one of the biggest problems with the armed forces is, as you mentioned, generation just now. I'm 46 years old, and around 14 was the same thing. But we were also told, man up, crack on. Boys don't cry, men don't cry. And as you join the armed forces, that's instilled in you even further. We don't talk about things. So if I talked about thoughts, feelings, and emotions whilst I was serving, I'd have been seen as a complete weirdo. But the problem is, that's exactly what I needed to do, because whilst it's in my head, that's fueling my little addict in my brain. And he's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Every thought that goes in there, every emotion that's not talked about, my addict gets stronger and bigger. And, that's what I believe we can release some of that with an hour a week sessions, with, interventions, with maybe a bit of CBT. I'm not qualified enough to question the efficiency of CBT, but for me personally, I can say it doesn't work. But what did work was talking, and was literally talking to somebody who nods their head, raises their eyebrows, and goes, "Yeah, no." That's really what got it.
It's it's very interesting. What you're saying about the culture. In the armed forces. I have a really good friend of mine. And I asked him. I said, "Oh, because I knew that he was in combat and all that. So, oh, do you have PTSD?" I said, "No." Then because I was going to a conference, I was staying on his place, and then I came in the evening. We were having a beer. I was a bit quiet. I said, "Oh, Pedro, you remember that this morning you told me if I had PTSD or you have been, have seen like really bad stuff, and then he started telling me stuff like, dead colleagues, you know, awful, awful stuff, you know, sometimes it's like, okay, people, they're not even aware, of how bad things got, it's okay, keep going. So I'm fine.
Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. I think the other element of that is that a lot of people join the forces from quite dysfunctional backgrounds, childhoods. So I've already explained my childhood. Where do I end up? I end up in the forces because that gives me security. It gives me accommodation. I'm away from my family home. So actually, a lot of people are already joining up with some trauma, with childhood trauma. So once you join the forces, we then have a lot of banter, which I always say to people, I loved it. I loved that close to the bone humor, the dark humor. But actually, do you know what? There were times where I was struggling and somebody would say something to me and I'd laugh it off. But it wasn't a laugh. It was going back here. And again, it was storing in my brain, and it was affecting me. But I couldn't show that it affected me. I couldn't show any weakness. I couldn't show any emotion. So I laughed, and that would make the banter even stronger. So when people talk about PTSD and talk about trauma, as you'll well know, we always think of one big incident in life, one big thing that's happened. For me, it's not. It's 20, 30, 40 smaller things, 20 things that teachers have said to me, my mum has said to me, that made me question my self-worth, self-belief. A teacher who says you'll never achieve anything. My sister is a consultant neurophysio, and she runs triathlons for New Zealand over 50s, has always run triathlons, played rugby, for England University. She's absolutely amazing person. But when you look at what drove that, was her teacher telling her you'll never be good at sports. Now, with a mindset very similar to mine and abilities very similar to mine, she has taken that and gone, I'll show you. Now, everybody will say how amazing she is, but the reality is, how healthy is that lifestyle also? Because she's consumed with work, physical exercise.
I mean, I have seen that, hundreds of times when you get someone that it takes like the good addictions, like what you're saying is, oh yeah, work 16 hours of a day, or doing like uh, 2 marathons a month. It's like, okay, you're completely absent from home, you're not engaged with anyone, you're obsessed, you're counting calories, anxious, and it's like, okay, it's socially accepted, and it's, oh well, you're doing so well being a CEO or whatever, or getting that medal. But sometimes it comes from a place of pain. Okay, dealing with, probably if you have put the same time, on drinking and gambling on something, probably you'll be, like, top of the class.
Yeah, of course it is. As I say, they all get celebrated, don't they, for being amazing people? Yeah, if you say I'm addicted to gambling, and I think a massive key point that you've just made, which is it doesn't matter what the addiction is, if we don't deal with or underlying why we use that in the first place, what we're running from, what we're escaping from, I could go to GA and I could learn to abstain for years, potentially. But as soon as a life event happens, say a bereavement or a divorce, my first go-to is always going to be to go back to my gambling. So where we were talking about treatment earlier, unless, I'm teaching you to suck eggs, Pedro, I'm sure, but, for other people watching, unless we really, truly be openly, massively honest about who we are, what we are, where we come from, and what affects us, then we are always going to have that addiction right on our shoulder, ready to go as soon as something happens in life. I'm not saying if a life event happened today, I wouldn't be affected. What I'm saying is I'd have time to consider the consequences and maybe not carry out that behavior.
Yeah, it's I, I completely agree. Sometimes you get people that say, "Oh, I got an addictive personality." I was doing this, and then I joined AA. Then I did this. I joined this thing, and I said, "Okay, maybe what you have is an unresolved conflict or something there that, you know, of course, if addiction worked before, that works. It's like, okay, so if I break a leg and I take some opioids, the pain is not going to be there, but the leg's still broken.
Yeah. And I still, I question mine today, that there's still quite a lot of work to do. It's an ongoing piece of work. It's something that, to say, even with my work now, I do love it because it's reaching people and it's helping people. But at the same time, is it a compulsion? Is it a need to still be filling a void? But it's also the same with food. And I was always one that says, I've got a addictive personality. It's not, food gives me comfort. So if I feel low, I feel, whatever, I start eating, and then my brain goes, oh, I feel so much better. So, but the next hour when that food starts to, or the sugar levels start to deplete, I need that sugar again. So I'll go and get more sugary food. And what happens is I go from 14 stone to about 19 or 20 stone. And I can do that every single year. People will see me from one year to the next and think I've not put a pound on. I have. I've put 4 stone on and lost 4 stone in that time, because I'll get to a point where I feel uncomfortable, I feel depressed, I feel anxious because I put weight on. So then I'll exercise to excess and I'll eat a lettuce a week, and I'll lose it. It's really unhealthy. And I can see that's unhealthy. And why is it that I don't now reach out for support for that? I'll go, oh, it's all right. The gambling's not there anymore, so it's okay. It's not okay. And actually, I need to keep doing that deeper work, I think.
It's it's really interesting what you say, because, for example, I sometimes I found that many people that they're in the path to recovery. They present themselves. Okay, I went through this and now I'm fine, and I'm and I think it's a bit of a process, because otherwise I think, like, they create a bit like a double stigma. Okay, so you have gone through a lot, and then if something really bad happened to you, you cannot even relapse because you have built this sort of recovery guru persona.
Yeah,
What do you
definitely.
think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Again, somebody asked me the other day how many peer support groups I still do, because in the early days after Gordon Moody, I was probably doing 9 or 10 hours a week between one-to-one work, peer support groups, ex-residence groups, things like that. And I said, I don't do any now. And obviously, because working in this kind of space as well, I'm very fortunate to do. So I do hear stories day in, day out, and you're aware. But the reality is I don't use that space to vent my own issues as much. And what happens is you get further down the line into recovery, people on those groups tend to look up to you. Now, if I go on after 3 years or 3.5 years or 4 years and start saying, I'm really struggling this week, it's been a nightmare, I fear that those in earlier recovery are going to get thrown off by that. And they'll maybe think, hang on, I was hoping I'd be completely fixed by the 3-year point. This guy's here talking about how hard life is. So you have a concern that you're going to affect somebody else earlier in recovery. So you end up not using that peer support group for what you need anymore. You almost become, as you say, like I wouldn't class myself as a guru, but you become that person that people might look up to and ask questions of. And if your answer is a negative one and it's a real struggle and it's hard work and it's a nightmare at year 3, year 4, actually, am I risking damaging that person's recovery? So, yeah.
But I suppose that the important thing is your own recovery. If you think
Mhm.
always about stuff, or I mean, I don't know how it works, but as a therapist, you're always struggling with your own stuff. Doesn't
Mm,
matter how many years you have your clients, and you don't talk with your clients, but with your own therapist or your supervisor is how
mm,
this thing is bothering me, or I got this stuff coming,
mm,
so I suppose it's okay, to say, okay, look, I'm my first year or my third year or fifth year of recovery, but this
mm,
happened and we're all humans. Okay, you know well, I don't
mm,
know, people wants to because I think probably I do understand that, okay, if you go to a group and it's your first week,
mm,
and somebody say, oh, it's my first year, and the other day almost,
mm,
bought a scratch card or something, and you say, oh man, this is not working. If you come for 5 years and you're still having, you know,
mm.
cravings from time to time.
Yeah, and I think there's a clear sort of line there between therapist and sort of client relationship, and then on the peer support groups, especially that I was part of, you're almost like a friend, So
Mm,
you feel if these people were my clients, I think, oh well, that's okay. Just I can be honest with them because this is the honest truth of recovery. It's not easy. Recovery doesn't mean you're going to wake up every day and feel better and the sun's shining and the birds are singing.
mm,
Recovery is just life, and life is hard some days.
mm,
Life is hard for everybody. You could wake up as a millionaire, you've still got your issues, you've still got problems. And I think that's what it can be scary at the beginning of recovery, because I always remember I wanted that quick fix, very much the same as gambling. I wanted to flick a switch and I don't gamble anymore. I wanted to take a tablet and it be fixed, and that's what I thought could happen. And it's
But
not reality. Yeah.
I think this sort of it's a bit dangerous because I mean, I believe that you have to pay some price. Okay,
Mm,
there's not magic bullet. Even if I'm doing
mhm,
my research on type of treatments, that can be a little bit faster. We don't know yet, but the sort of Ozempic, stuff like this. Oh,
mm,
good. I just do this and I'm not hungry. And like,
mm,
I, I'm sure, that, I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but there'll be
mm,
some side effects at some point that they didn't thought about, or some some stuff, or we have seen that with antidepressants. So you okay, you go to therapy, talk about things that you don't want to talk and they're really difficult, and you're going to have you know a tough time, and you may improve a little bit, or take this tablet. Okay, where do
mm.
I have to sign for the tablet?
Yeah,
But then
yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, it's really interesting that you brought up about antidepressants, because I was delivering some training and a talk to NHS Somerset yesterday, their PCT, and a GP asked me about had I ever had antidepressants, had I gone to my GP, and I said, yeah, I had. The initial attempt to prove to my partner that it wasn't just me being an asshole, I had something wrong with me. So if I took a packet of tablets home that the doctor's given me, she's going to have a lot more tolerance, for what I had done. But when I started taking them, and I ended up going from, say, citalopram to sertraline to ended up on venlafaxine on like 275 milligrams. And the venlafaxine was actually very, very dangerous, because potentially I didn't need them, because actually it was gambling that was causing my depressive state. And if I had a big win, I'd probably feel better about myself for the minute. But what happens is, on the venlafaxine, I become numb. I didn't feel highs, I didn't feel lows. So gambling just become whatever. If I lose, I lose. If I win, I win. And actually, it was just about getting rid of the money at that stage. So
You
actually,
know,
prescribing antidepressants can be dangerous.
it's it's really interesting what you're saying. Because have you had a look at the nice guidelines for gambling?
I had a read, but mainly over the veterans.
So
Yeah.
basically, what my main worry there is that, okay, they recommend CBT, you know,
Mm,
and then I think it was I don't remember. I think it's a opioid partial agonist.
hmm
It's okay. This is what uh, alcoholics get,
Yeah.
or opioid user gets. So then the
hmm
opioid doesn't give you you know
Yeah.
the kick. So
hmm
it feels to me like, okay, but this is you know a bit of the race. Okay, you're going to get sort of emotionally
mm
numb, and I'm a bit worried, because I think I read once a study, and there's not that, you know there's that much published about it, so it feels a bit like, oh, I'm not sure if this is again trying to have a magic bullet, and we know that the NHS is under a lot of pressure. So if you
mm
go to your GP and say, okay, option one, therapy, okay, waiting list forever.
hmm
So let's go to option two. Here you go. That's your prescription.
mm And yeah, I think you mentioned the NHS there and the costs, and I think one of my biggest, concerns is that if this became NHS first, NHS only treatment for gambling, my real concern is that the suicide rate could well increase, because if I was told when I reached out for support that it was going to be 6 months that I had to wait, the chances are I wouldn't be here today. I couldn't live another day as a gambler. And if Gordon Moody had said to me it's going to be a 6 month waiting list, I probably wouldn't be here today. And I think it's very much the same with that research going into that. There's a lot of talk and a lot of lobbying and a lot of behind the scenes arguments, as you well know, and the politics of this space and the funding and everything else. That actually what we're missing is that individual who's out there today needing support, needing help, whilst all of these politicians and lobbyists are all arguing amongst themselves over who should be funded, who shouldn't. And
I
actually, that
mean,
individual needs funding for help.
it's something that, it's a bit upsetting, because I have
Mm,
worked in different charities and all that. And, okay, nothing is perfect, but they tend to try their best, and
yeah.
there never have been so much funding for
Mm,
treatment, and actually, the charities, they don't have access to it now. So it's a shame. I just think, look, so you have something that, okay, maybe the NHS is better, but don't get rid of something, because you won't be able to get it back once it's gone. You can say, okay, let's run it, both. Let's do research. Let's see, bit of A/B testing, and if we see, okay, NHS is 100 times better, or 5 times better, or 2 times better, then you can say, okay, look. But there's also, like, I think the person that looks for help, okay, there may be people that, they're happy going to, NHS clinic, and there'll
mm,
be other people that you say, look, I want to go somewhere else, so I think, it's the person's choice at the
mm,
end of the day. I mean, I don't know. It's so very complicated, and
mm,
I think things are not looking good for many
mm.
organizations. But only
Yeah,
time
I
will
would.
tell.
It wasn't my intention to get into that today, but it obviously always comes about that, because my work that I carry out, I seen a parliamentary event the other day, or a Commons committee, that where somebody was saying about how the education isn't effective, and how the education may have been tainted by industry or what have you. And I thought, do you know what, that's calling my morals into question, because you're effectively saying that I would deliver this education to the armed forces knowing that it wasn't effective. I know it's effective. I know the work we do in the Armed Forces Gambling Support Network and with Beacon Counselling Trust is massively effective. So to have an MP with no real knowledge other than listening to his lobby group you know, we need to look at what's actually being delivered, because there's great education work going on. There's great prevention work going on. There's work on both sides that's being done massively. And what we need is mediation rather than arguments and the individual again being missed out.
100%. I think this sort of thing, like, look, even just having information is
Mm.
helpful. This is like basic public health. Okay, if you tell someone,
Yeah.
that, okay, if you eat bacon, you're going to have heart issues or cholesterol, whatever. Okay, you can make an informed decision. It's okay. I'm not going to have the bacon butty. I'm going to have something else.
I'm still
I
having it. Do you know what I mean?
it's
I love
it's
it.
it's
Yeah, go on. Sorry.
it's all right, but you
Yeah.
can make the decision. At the end of the day, it's on you. If you don't know that, okay, look, you need to be careful, because if you do this too much, you can end up in trouble. I think is basic, basic stuff.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing with in prison. How does it work? Is there like a group setting, so you go there, talk with inmates, or some people, they talk about, okay, like, I got access to a phone, and I put some bets, or do
Yeah.
people here
Yeah.
manage to put bets?
Yeah, so the gambling within prison could be on absolutely anything. Prisoners would gamble on two cockroaches running up a wall. But they don't. They have, so they'll do a football pools. So loads of lads select what scores they think it's going to be at the weekend. They all put a box of vapes in, say £3 of value, and whoever wins those 15 boxes of vapes. People bet on pool, double or quits, double or quits, double or quits, till somebody's £30-40 in debt. There's poker. Almost every single day you will walk on a wing and people are playing poker. The National Lottery bonus pool. So everybody will put £1 worth of canteen in. Whoever gets that gets the 50 odd pound winnings from the lottery bonus pool. There'll be horse racing at the weekend, so they'll pick and they'll do a syndicate on each race. Anything they can think to bet on, they will do in prison. And then, as you mentioned, there's the phone. In-cell phones now allow people to phone home and ask outside people to put bets on for them. So they'll get the newspaper, they'll look at what bets they want to place, and they'll phone up and put the bets on that morning. And in there, one of the biggest crippling things is the boredom and the lack of purpose. Whereas when you're gambling, it's curing some of that boredom, because you're waiting for that race result to come in, and there's maybe a bit of excitement that day where you've had no excitement for ages because you're in prison. There's nothing going on. And so I know that's happening in there. And one of the biggest problems is the officer's perception of it, which is, if I was drinking or taking drugs, I'm going to receive extra days. I'm going to get prosecuted again within the prison environment. But if you're gambling, the officer walks past and asks who's winning. Now, gambling is as illegal in prison as drinking or drugs, but the officers will openly, happily let you gamble because it's curing your boredom and you're not off causing trouble elsewhere. So, but the perception of levels of debt that come from gambling in prison are probably higher than the debts associated with alcohol or drugs in prison. So there's families being threatened on the outside for the money that's owed for a gambling debt in prison. So yet again, the families are the ones suffering for the gamblers' actions. And what I've seen is, where I set up my own peer support groups, I'd done a survey, a whole prison survey of 700 prisoners, and it was 24.8% said that they believe they had a problem or had been told that their gambling was a problem by a family member. So 25%, 175 people out of 700. And I set up the groups. Now, what we found on the groups is, and I was even surprised by this, the crimes that people were there for. There was obviously coercive control. There was domestic violence. There was shoplifting, theft, fraud. The biggest one for me was drug dealing. I never really considered it, but people started off dealing grams and ounces. They were making excess cash, and they started spending that excess cash on gambling. Some of them had gone to the casino to clean up their cash, to launder their cash. So And when they're in that casino, they've obviously got to play for an hour to make it look realistic. They then like that. And what's happened is their tolerance level, like I said earlier, the tolerance grows for the amount you need to bet to get the same buzz. And they've ended up having to sell kilos to get enough money to fulfill their tolerance. And that led to much, much longer sentences.
It's interesting because something that I always found, like, people like, struggling with gambling sometimes become very resourceful, and it's this sort
Mhm.
of thing. Okay, people can become successful to feed, the gambling addiction, at least for some times, until things go down.
Mhm.
And with what you're saying is okay, so if I'm a better dealer or,
Mhm.
trafficker, then I can
Yeah.
I can spend more money in gambling. So rather than selling what you say an ounce, I sell a
Mhm.
kilo, so I get more money. And it's
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because I'm conscious of
Yeah.
time, and I wanted to focus a little bit at your armed forces work.
Mhm.
Could you tell us a little bit about, you know, I know that, it's a bit of the
Mhm.
idea, if they just got a improvised explosive device in Iraq, and then they traumatize and they just gambling. But what you say is a bit
Mhm.
like, actually it's complex trauma. You had a
Mhm.
difficult childhood, difficult at school, you know, uh, difficult in many cases, and then on top, the army, that you can help someone, but for others, it can be also difficult. Uh, what's the sort of prevalence, that you guys are finding between armed forces and veterans in terms of
Yeah,
trauma from gambling?
as I mentioned earlier, sort of on that joining up, you've got the pressures of training, you've got the peer pressure. So if you don't, probably if you're not gambling or you're not having a risk with them, you're not fitting in, and everybody wants to fit in. You've got a new salary for the first time. You've got the offer of borrowing for the first time, loans from banks, credit cards from banks. There's also the need to have the best car. They're quite a big thing in the forces. I want to fit in, and I've got a house. Well, I've got a bigger house, and um, but also if we look at the practicalities of it. So if you're out in Afghanistan, you're coming into contact every day. That adrenaline that you're getting daily, the dopamine dump that you're getting daily from being in that contact, when you come back to the UK, where are you getting that buzz from? So gambling could become a thing, but also single living accommodation. So we've gone from living in billets of 4 or 6 or even 20 in a mess to everything is single living accommodation. So we're not talking anymore. We're not mixing socially anymore. We're in rooms where gaming is happening, and we all know that gaming can lead to gambling. Again, it goes back to not being able to talk about thoughts, feelings, and emotions. We're not encouraged to talk about things that are going on for us. The forces even more so. So that's just some of them. But also, when we look at the transition period coming out of the forces, we all get very excited about leaving. Life is going to be amazing. I'm going to get this great civilian job. I'm going to get a house. I'm going to do this. We're going to go on holidays whenever I want. But the reality is, when you wake up that morning after you leave the forces, you've lost your sense of purpose. You've lost your sense of identity. You're just a civilian now. You're just another number. Whereas before, I was a serviceman. But also, you've got a pension pot, so a large pot of money. But that pot starts to go down very quickly when you've got to pay, market rate rent, and you've got no income. That pot starts to dwindle, and you'll then risk money, potentially gambling, to get that pot back up.
Mm.
So maybe you're not finding employment as quickly as you were promised you would. Maybe there's arguments in the home because your partner's not used to you being home for months. And all of a sudden, you're messing with the children's bed routine. You're wanting to do things at weekends, or you're maybe wanting to go bed later than your wife normally would, or your husband normally would. Just everything. You're not used to living together. So marriages are 15, 20 years where they say, oh, we've been happily married for 20 years. The reality is you might have only been married for 10 because you've been away for the other 10, and you
Yeah.
get a break from each other every few months.
Mm.
So it keeps a relationship fresh. As soon as you're home 24/7, you may start noticing niggles in them that you never considered before. So all of these reasons lead to us being, according to Swansea University's research, 10 times at higher risk than the general population.
Wow.
So it's really key why we do this work. And with it being myself or a veteran delivering that training, delivering that support, those people buy into it. You never ever lose that connection. Doesn't matter how old that person gets. Whilst you're a veteran, you still belong in that community. So it really matters that we deliver it from a place of knowing.
One last question, if I may. Why there's so much, stigma, in the armed forces? Because I've been, contacting associations, like more than 200 in the UK. Say, do you have any people, that maybe, they're not. We don't have any problem with gambling, alcohol, of course, but do you screen for it? No, we don't, but we don't have any problem. I just feel a bit like, okay, there's a doors closed. Yeah, we don't gamble here. We don't do this sort of stuff.
Yeah, they don't want to admit it, and they were very much the same like that with alcohol. They didn't want to admit the alcohol issue for many, many years. And, we're facing that same problem sometimes, which is we don't have a problem with that here. Now, my question to them is, and what I always use is a screenshot or a photo of 5 very happy looking servicemen and women. And I always say to them, which one of those is gambling? Which one of those is suffering from gambling harm? And they look and go, well, yeah, and they look in and they're like, well, I don't know. How can I tell? I said, but how can you tell me then that your servicemen that are serving under you, service people, personnel, aren't suffering? You wouldn't know. You cannot 100% tell me that you do not have a problem in your regiment, your ship, your base, your station. You cannot 100% tell me that you haven't got a problem. There's no way of telling. I can't tell them they have, but they can't tell me they haven't. But what we can do is continue to deliver the education just in case there is somebody in that room that day that is struggling. And they're better off having it. It's free of charge. They're better off receiving that training than they are not at all. And that's what it comes down to.
And thank you very much for your time today. Have been an absolute
thank you for yours.
pleasure.